Much about poverty is obvious enough. One does not need elaborate criteria, cunning measurement, or probing analysis to recognize raw poverty and to understand its antecedents. It would be natural to be impatient with long-winded academic studies on poor, naked wretches with houseless heads and unfed sides and looped and windowed raggedness, to use King Lear's graphic description. And furthermore, it may also be the case, as Lear told the blind Gloucester, that a man may see how this world goes with no eyes. There is indeed much that is transparent about poverty and misery. But not everything about poverty is quite so simple. Even the identification of the poor and the diagnosis of poverty may be far from obvious when we move away from extreme and raw poverty. Different approaches can be used. Biological inadequacy, relative deprivation, and there are technical issues to be resolved within each approach. Furthermore, to construct an overall picture of poverty, it is necessary to go well beyond identifying the poor. To provide an aggregate profile based on the characteristics of those who are identified as poor, problems of aggregation have to be squarely faced. Finally, and most importantly, the causation of poverty raises questions that are not easily answered. While the immediate antecedents of poverty may be too obvious to need such analysis, and the ultimate causation too vague and open-ended a question to be settled fully, there are various intermediate levels of useful answers that are worth exploring. The problem is of particular relevance in the context of recent discussions on the causation of hunger and starvation. This monograph is concerned with these questions. The main focus of this work is on the causation of starvation in general and of famines in particular. The basic approach, which involves analyzing entitlement systems, is introduced in general terms in Chapter 1. This is done even before the concepts of poverty are examined in any detail, because that is where the thrust of this monograph lies. In Chapters 2 and 3, problems of conceptualization and measurement of poverty are examined. The specific problem of starvation is taken up in very general terms in Chapter 4, and the entitlement approach is analyzed in Chapter 5. This is followed by case studies of famines from different parts of the world. The Great Bengal Famine of 1943, the Ethiopian famines of 1973 to 75, famines in the Sahel region of Africa during the early 1970s, and the Bangladesh famine of 1974. Lastly, the entitlement approach is consolidated, taking up general issues of deprivation related to entitlement systems. There are 4 technical appendices. Appendix A presents a formal analysis of the notion of exchange entitlement, an important aspect of entitlement systems. The relevance of failures of exchange entitlement for the development of famine situations is brought out in Appendix B in terms of some illustrative models. Appendix C provides an examination of the problem of poverty and its measurement, including a scrutiny of various measures that have been used or proposed. Finally, the pattern of famine mortality is discussed in Appendix D based on a case study of the Bengal famine of 1943. Finally, a remark on presentation. While some mathematical concepts and notation have been used in Appendices A through C, the text of the monograph is almost entirely informal. Someone concerned with the detailed structures would have to consult the appendices, but there should be no difficulty in following the main lines of the argument, including the case studies, without reference to them. I have tried to make the book accessible to as wide an audience as possible, since the subject matter of this work is important. I am also immodest enough to believe that the analysis presented in this monograph has a certain amount of relevance to matters of practical concern. Chapter 1. Poverty and Entitlements. 1.1. Entitlements and Ownership. Starvation is the characteristic of some people not having enough to eat. It is not the characteristic of there being not enough food to eat. While the latter can be a cause of the former, it is but one of many possible causes. Whether and how starvation relates to food supply is a matter for factual investigation. Food supply statements say things about a commodity or group of commodities considered on its own. Starvation statements are about the relationship of persons to the commodity or that commodity group. The contrast between commodities on the one hand and the relationship of commodities to persons on the other is central also to many other economic exercises. The evaluation of real national income is an important example, and for a departure from the traditional approaches to national income to relation-based evaluation in the light of this distinction, see Sen, 1976b, 1979a. Leaving out cases in which a person may deliberately starve, starvation statements translate readily into statements of ownership of food by persons. In order to understand starvation, it is, therefore, necessary to go into the structure of ownership. Ownership relations are one kind of entitlement relations. It is necessary to understand the entitlement systems within which the problem of starvation is to be analyzed. This applies more generally to poverty as such, and more specifically to famines as well. An entitlement relation applied to ownership connects one set of ownerships to another through certain rules of legitimacy. It is a recursive relationship, and the process of connecting can be repeated. Consider a private ownership market economy. I own this loaf of bread. Why is this ownership accepted? Because I got it by exchange through paying some money I owned. Why is my ownership of that money accepted? Because I got it by selling a bamboo umbrella owned by me. Why is my ownership of the bamboo umbrella accepted? Because I made it with my own labor using some bamboo from my land. Why is my ownership of the land accepted? Because I inherited it from my father. Why is his ownership of that land accepted? And so on. Each link in this chain of entitlement relations legitimizes one set of ownership by reference to another, or to some basic entitlement, in the form of enjoying the fruits of one's own labor. The interpretation of entitlement relations here is descriptive rather than prescriptive. In contrast, Robert Nozick's 1974 well-known exploration of the entitlement theory of justice is prescriptive, discussing private property rights and other rights in normative terms. The two exercises are thus differently motivated and must not be confused with each other. Entitlement relations accepted in a private ownership market economy typically include the following, among others. Trade-based entitlement. One is entitled to own what one obtains by trading something one owns with a willing party, or multilaterally with a willing set of parties. Production-based entitlement. One is entitled to own what one gets by arranging production using one's own resources, or resources hired from willing parties meeting the agreed conditions of trade. Own labor entitlement. One is entitled to one's own labor power, and thus to the trade-based and production-based entitlements related to one's own labor power. Inheritance and transfer entitlement. One is entitled to own what is willingly given to one by another who legitimately owns it, possibly to take effect after the latter's death, if so specified by him. These are some entitlement relations of more or less straightforward kind, but there are others, frequently a good deal more complex. For example, one may be entitled to enjoy the fruits of some property without being able to trade it for anything else. Or one may be able to inherit the property of a deceased relation who did not bequeath it to anyone, through some rule of kinship-based inheritance accepted in the country in question. Or one may have some entitlements related to unclaimed objects on the basis of discovery. Market entitlements may even be supplemented by rationing or coupon systems, even in private ownership market economies, such as in Britain during the last war. This may or may not be combined with price control, and that, in its turn, may or may not be combined with a flourishing black market. The scope of ownership relations can vary greatly with economic systems. A socialist economy may not permit private ownership of means of production, thereby rendering production-based entitlements inoperative, except when it involves just one's own labor and some elementary tools and raw materials. A capitalist economy will not only permit the private ownership of means of production, that is indeed one of its main foundations. On the other hand, a capitalist economy, like a socialist one, will not permit ownership of one human being by another, as a slave economy will. A socialist economy may restrict the employment of one person by another for production purposes, for instance, constrain the possibility of private trading of labor power for productive use. A capitalist economy will not, of course, do this, but may impose restrictions on binding contracts involving labor power obligations over long periods of time. This, however, is the standard system under some feudal practices involving bonded labor, and also in some cases of colonial plantations.